So governments at state and federal level think that this is a really good idea. And we still don't have one.
We still have no national firearms register, even though everyone is in agreement.
That's correct. It doesn't exist. And there's no good reason for why it doesn't exist.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute. On the 28th of April 1996, Australia was rocked by horrifying scenes from Port Arthur in Tasmania.
Good evening. A siege is underway in the Tasmanian town of Port Arthur.
Forever scarred by the memory of Australia's most deadly massacre.
We never thought those sort of things could happen in our country, but they did.
One man killed 35 people and wounded another 23 with semi-automatic rifles. It's still the deadliest massacre in modern Australian history. And in response, the Howard government took brave action.
It was the biggest gun buyback the modern world had seen. And so controversial, a newly elected John Howard wore a bulletproof vest after announcing it.
I can remember discussing this issue with some of my staff, and one or two of them said to me, "You're not really thinking of banning all semi-automatics, are you?" And I said, yes. I said, we might as well go for broke on this. It was the right thing for Australia, and it has meant that fewer people have been killed.
Just 12 days after Port Arthur, the government announced the National Firearms Agreement, which introduced a range of controls at the federal, state and territory levels. It took significant political courage. Gun law reform was unpopular with many of John Howard's supporters. Now, gun reform is rightly held up as a major achievement of that government. But nearly 30 years after the massacre, Australia's firearm laws aren't living up to the promise of the Howard government's bravery, according to Australia Institute research. And joining me to discuss how and why this research matters is research manager Alice Grundy. G'day, Alice.
Hi, Eb.
And with her is Australia Institute and Cantor Fellow Skye Predavec. G'day,
Hey.
Skye. Alice, I want to start with you. Obviously, Port Arthur was really a turning point for gun laws in Australia. Can you just walk us back in history to what measures John Howard took as Prime Minister?
At the time of Port Arthur, there were a lot of semi-automatic firearms in Australia. And these are the kinds of weapons that you see in US-style massacres. They're firearms that are designed to efficiently kill a lot of people in a short period of time.
Yeah.
So one of the major changes that the Howard government introduced was banning semi-automatic firearms. And this has had an extraordinary effect on Australia. It's made a huge difference in terms of reducing the number of firearm-related fatalities.
Yeah.
And the Howard government also introduced a gun buyback scheme. So they recognised that we needed to both reduce the number of firearms in Australia and have a scheme where people could return the firearms that were now illegal. So that buyback scheme was a massive change. There were around 600,000 firearms that were returned under that scheme, many of them destroyed. And so it completely changed firearm safety in Australia.
And when you say it changed, I mean, safety is one thing, but overall, the impact of taking that many guns out of circulation, what do we know about the impact that's had?
When you look at the statistics for how many people have been killed by a firearm, the number has really drastically dropped. But it also means that the kinds of firearms that people have has changed. So in Australia, you need to give a genuine reason for applying for a firearm license. And the kinds of reasons that people give these days are things like sporting, shooting, or hunting, or collecting. And having a genuine reason requirement is one way that you can potentially have better control over firearms and make sure that Well, ideally, you would be making sure that people are acquiring a firearm for the stated purpose on their application.
And Skye, thinking about the present now, obviously it's many, many years since the Port Arthur massacre. What do we know about the circulation of firearms in Australia in 2025?
Well, we know that there's a lot of them. So there's over 4 million guns in Australia now. That's more than were here before the Port Arthur massacre. And we also know that, well, we don't know enough about firearms circulation fundamentally. You know, there's still no national firearms register, which means that the only easy ways to get data in some places is to do freedom of information requests to the police. And there's no regular public information on things like how many get stolen.
So just walk me through, what are some of the things that we don't know about firearms that it would be useful to know?
Well, we don't consistently know exactly where they are. So we don't know across all states in a given postcode how many guns there are. You can't always check your local area to see how many people have firearms licenses and how many people have guns. And we don't know in a lot of places what the genuine reasons that people have given to get those guns. So there's just a lack of information across the board.
Do we know, for example, what kind of guns make up these 4 million guns?
A lot of the time we know the broad category of guns because there's, a certain requirement for them on the firearms licenses. But again, even that is a state-by-state thing.
Yeah.
New South Wales tends to be the best for releasing this information, but a lot of the other states, it's just impossible to know without making a formal request exactly what that makeup is.
Yeah. And what does that mean for Australia's safety?
It means that the community has a hard time making informed decisions about what they think they need in terms of firearm safety.
So that's touching on safety, but I guess my other question for you, Alice, is how do the current laws as they stand and these current numbers of firearms compare to what John Howard envisaged when he first pushed through the National Firearms Agreement? I'm talking here, I guess, about both, the actual legislation itself, but also the spirit of what the government was trying to accomplish.
One of the key planks of the Howard government reforms to firearm legislation in Australia was the proposal for a national firearms register. And this is something that all of the states and territories agreed to in 1996, and they agreed again in 2017. So governments at state and federal level think that this is a really good idea. And we still don't have one.
We still have no national firearms register, even though everyone is in agreement.
That's correct. It doesn't exist. And there's no good reason for why it doesn't exist. At the moment, the information that we have is that the register will come into existence by the end of 2028. That's the timeline on the Attorney General's website. But that's 3 years from now. We don't know what will happen in those next 3 years. And the National Firearms Register is something that law enforcement has been calling for, that they think that would help safety, it would help their officers. There are instances, for example, between ACT and New South Wales. If the police want to share information, it's a manual process. It's picking up the phone. It's actually speaking to someone who has to then check their records. It's very resource intensive under the current way that things are, under the status quo. So what we need is an efficient system. Now, the National Firearms Register is not a way of keeping track of everyone's firearms and publishing it on the internet so that anyone could go and rob that house and get that firearm. The point of the National Firearms Register is to give police access to the information that they need to help community safety. So in Australia, we have porous borders. If you're in Queensland, you can get to New South Wales easily. It's possible that, for example, you could have a limit on how much ammunition you're allowed to buy in Queensland, or you could have a limit on your license saying that you're not allowed to purchase new firearms. It would be possible to drive across the border into New South Wales and purchase ammunition, purchase firearms, potentially in contravention of a limitation that you have in the other state, and then just travel back across the border. So it's not just us saying that a national firearms register is important. It's also organisations like the Queensland Police Union who think that it would be really useful for their police in order to have access to this tool.
And one that's easy for law enforcement to use, essentially, that's not putting barriers in the way of being able to do their job and protect community safety.
Obviously, gun control doesn't work. It can't work. It will never work. So how was your scheme a failure?
Well, my scheme was not a failure. We had a massacre at a place called Port Arthur 17 years ago, and there have been none since.
Our history with gun control and regulation is obviously very different to the United States.
They're very different countries with very different sets of problems. But I think we're well on the way to solving that horrible problem.
Gun violence has terrorized and traumatized so many of our communities in this country. And let us be clear, it does not have to be this way, as our friends in Australia have demonstrated. And with that, then,
Alice, so often Australians look at the horrifying reports of gun violence in the United States, and obviously we are really grateful for the gun controls that we have in place here. How do our gun laws compare with other countries?
We are obviously doing a lot better than the United States. But
that wouldn't be hard.
Yeah, it's a low bar. We clear that one at least. But there are other countries that we could still learn things from. So, for example, the UK has very strict firearm legislation. And per capita, they have fewer firearm deaths than we do. Mm-hmm. The same is true for Spain, for Germany, for South Korea, and for Japan. So there's still room for Australia to improve in terms of firearm safety. And there are some really straightforward things the governments can do. There was a really tragic case in Western Australia where a man was reportedly looking for his wife. And when he didn't find her, he found his wife's friend and her daughter, and he killed them with a firearm. It was in part in response to that the Western Australian government implemented a range of new measures, including changes to the responses law enforcement can take after the reporting of an incident of domestic violence. They're also the only state or territory in the whole of Australia that has a limit on the number of firearms that someone can have. So in WA, they've set the limit at 10. That's not to say no person can ever have more than 10 firearms, but that's the starting point. Whereas, for example, there's someone in metropolitan Sydney who has 380 firearms. Now, that's legal, they're licensed, and they may well keep them very carefully, but it doesn't meet community expectations to have such a high number of firearms in a suburban setting.
Mm. Skye, what impact has technology had on our ability to control access to firearms?
I think the biggest notable thing with technology in terms of our ability to control firearms is that we're not using it with things like the National Firearms Register.
If I can just add to what Skye was saying there about technology, the other major concern at the moment is around 3D printed firearms. So this means that it's possible to create a firearm in your own backyard if you have a 3D printer and the blueprints. And the real concern is not just creating the firearm, but that it would be possible after committing a crime to destroy the 3D printed firearm much more easily than a traditional firearm. Now, there are 2 states in Australia where the blueprints for 3D printed firearms are illegal, but elsewhere in the country, they're not. And this is why it's really important to have consistent laws around Australia. So it means that it's not possible to just get the blueprints in one state and travel across the border into another state.
And when doing this research for the Australia Institute, how hard has it been to access basic information here? Like, walk me through what it's like trying to compile some of these basic statistics and things like that. How hard is it to get this information, even as a researcher?
Well, some states, thank God, make it relatively straightforward. Again, New South Wales is probably in the A tier for this, but other states make it a complete nightmare. The ACT is generally the worst one, where they're resistant to even the idea of someone putting in an FOI, and many other states still require a freedom of information process, don't necessarily regularly update their data. When WA got back to us, for example, they just chopped off the last 6 months of the FOI request because it wasn't in a document they already had and didn't want to do anything about it. So it is really hard to get proper information.
Yeah.
Another example is the Australian Institute of Criminology. So we don't have up-to-date information on how many crimes are committed with licensed versus unlicensed firearms. The most recent information we have is from 2018. So we think it's time that we had law enforcement agencies and other bodies actually keeping track of these things so that policy decisions can be well informed.
Yeah, because I guess the policy approach differs a lot depending on the type of firearm, how it got lost or stolen, all of those kinds of things. And yeah, not making it easy to respond in a policy sense or otherwise. Alice, in response to the Australia Institute's research, one lobby group has said that from 1996 to 2018, the rate of gun deaths dropped. And doesn't that suggest that gun laws are actually doing what they're supposed to? And, you know, why we bother looking into this? What's your response to that?
I'm very happy that the number of gun deaths have dropped. But my question is, how many firearm deaths are acceptable? Is it okay that a couple of hundred people are killed by a firearm in a given year? And as I mentioned, there are other countries that are doing better than us. So we think that just because the rate has decreased, it doesn't mean that we should just say job done. There's still more that we can do to protect Australians.
And so what would some of the things that you would recommend for how to address this situation?
So first of all, what I'd say is that the community expectations are for strict firearm controls in Australia. The Australia Institute did some polling at the end of last year and found that 64% of people surveyed think that Australia's firearm legislation should be stronger. It's really only a very small number of people proportionally who think that we should relax our firearm legislation. That's 12% of people surveyed. There are a few things that would help around the country. So the first example is a limit on the number of firearms that somebody can own. The second one is to make sure that the genuine reason why someone has acquired a firearm is enforced. The only state that has a requirement of participation in the activity listed as the genuine reason is New South Wales. Well, we think that if it is a genuine reason, then it should be straightforward to prove that the person with the firearm is using it for that purpose.
And what are some of those purposes? Can you just walk us through that for us non-gun owners?
So one example would be hunting or sport shooting. There's a survey that the Australian government does every year called Ausplay. And that shows that for 2023-24, the number of people who are participating in sporting, shooting, and hunting was around 60,000 people if we combine two separate categories. Now, that's a very small number of people who are participating in these activities if you think about it in comparison with the total number of licenses across the country. So you're looking at other things, including collecting. But the question is, if people aren't using the firearm for the stated purpose on their license, why are they still holding on to the firearm?
I know, Alice, you've done a lot of media interviews recently on this research, and you've been talking publicly about the need for reforms. And some of the pushback from some of these lobby groups has more or less insinuated that the Australia Institute is threatening community safety. I mean, are there any risks associated with, I don't know, criminals using publicly available information about firearms in Australia? What's the nature of these concerns? Is there anything to it?
One concern has been that if there were a national firearms register, then it would give criminals a treasure map and they could go and find the firearms and steal them from the people's houses. Well, the first issue is that firearms are supposed to be stored in an incredibly serious safe. There's absolutely no evidence saying, first of all, that New South Wales, which already does this and has done for a number of years, there's no evidence that in New South Wales criminals are targeting people with firearms after having found the information through the register. Second of all, it's at postcode level. It's not saying you look in this neighbourhood and this series of
Go
streets
around to
and that's
Ebony's house.
that's where you'll find it. And postcodes are determined by population, not by area. So it's not as though you could say, this one farm in WA is an entire postcode, so I'll just go there and find the firearm. That's not how postcodes work. So it's just not a live issue.
And it's primarily, as you said, it's for the use of law enforcement, and they're part of the reason for requesting this, essentially. And all the state and territory governments are in agreement. So it's hugely non-controversial in actual fact. Is that right?
Yeah. And these are separate points. So the National Firearms Register used by law enforcement and by retailers of ammunition and firearms, that's one thing. The other thing is the disclosure of information at a postcode level, which New South Wales currently does. That's another thing. They're separate questions. They're not related.
Okay. So, Alice, we've already done a little bit of research into this issue, but what other issues are on the horizon when it comes to gun law reforms and what the Australian public deserves to know about firearms in Australia?
We're keen to find out as much as possible how many crimes are committed with licensed versus unlicensed firearms. A pushback that we have from some of these pro-firearm lobby groups is that all of the crime is committed with unlicensed firearms. So stop talking about the law-abiding people who look after their firearms correctly and focus on the criminals. Well, first of all, I recognise that there are very, very many, in fact, the vast majority of firearm owners who are responsible. But the most recent information that we have about licensed versus unlicensed firearms is from 2018. That's just too long ago. So we need more recent information about that. The other thing that we're interested in is firearm theft. So we don't have very good information. It's nowhere publicly available information on how many firearms are stolen in a given year and what happens to them afterwards. So that's another piece of research that we're looking into.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
You can find all of our research on guns and much, much more on our website at australiainstitute.org.au or via the link in the show notes. And you can pre-order the second edition of our Vantage Point essay series, Dead Centre, How Political Pragmatism is Killing Us by Richard Dennis, where he argues that the quest for the sensible centre in Australian politics is not only pointless, but flies in the face of evidence. You can pre-order it now for $19.95 or become a subscriber to the Vantage Point series at our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store. This episode was recorded on Friday, the 25th of July, and some things may have changed since recording. Our theme music is by Jonathan McPhee from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.